Chapter 8. We stayed 2 weeks in St. Louis before Jamie said he was ready to move on. He rejected my suggestion that we use the wedding gift to travel to North Dakota, saying only, "For now, it's best we go to a place I know." Disappointed though I was, I had to trust him. I was 17 and he was older and sure of himself, and even when the money he earned ran out, he never asked for the gold eagles I carried in the money bag under my dress. I felt proud, knowing he trusted me with that small fortune. I believed that when I got older and proved myself worthy, he'd trust my opinions too. Every evening he brought food for our supper with enough left over for the next morning. And the first day he didn't work, he brought soap and carried up buckets of water so I could wash our clothes. When he was with me, I laughed all the time, but during the long days without him, I felt sad and missed my cousins. Jamie said their life would be harder than ours. One night, he took me dancing, not to the barn social, but to a new place, and to my pleasure, he kept me to himself. I was glad, for I was in the arms of the best dancer in the room, the most handsome and the most fun, and I would have been sorry to dance with anyone else. He had an engaging way of telling a story, and nights when he was not too tired, we walked out together, and he entertained me with tales of the people and places he'd known in his childhood. He'd done all kinds of work, and even as a youngster he'd helped his father and brother chop down trees and shape ties for the new railroads being built for the lumber mills. I was curious to hear of his family, but he said there was only his brother now, and he was a rough old fart. Our journey to West Virginia lasted weeks, sometimes on foot and sometimes by train. We stayed a few days in rooming houses along the river, where Jamie found work at the docks, but at other times, we slept out or slept sitting up on the train. Wherever we were, I was happiest when he was by my side. When we were alone, he sang to me and told funny stories that made me want to see his homeland. When I asked why he left West Virginia, he said, "I knew I'd meet someone like you." I wondered what I was like. He made up stories about our fellow passengers, shocking, wicked stories that made me laugh. Because he took care of everything, I worried about nothing. He was most attentive when we were crowded by strangers. But of course there were times on our travel when we could not be together, such as the railroad stations, where there were separate toilets for men and women. "Sit with women," he'd say, anytime we needed to part. I always heeded his instructions, but one night when we were delayed in a train depot, the women on each side of me picked up their valises and left the bench to board their train. Then 2 men took their places. These men smelled of liquor, and they seemed bent on annoying me. First they leaned across me to talk as though I weren't there. "Please excuse me," I said, trying to get away. No, stay right here," the one man said. The other grabbed my arm and pulled me down. "Give us a smile now." "You got a pretty smile." "Benny, ain't she got a pretty smile?" "That she do," Benny said. "She's so sweet I think I'll just take her home to Ma." Both had their heads close to my face when Jamie seized Benny by the shirt collar and jerked him to the floor. By the time 2 railroad guards stopped him, he'd hit the other man in the nose, pulled him from the bench and punched him in the stomach, then turned and kicked Benny as he was trying to get himself up. The speed and violence of his attack had frozen me to the bench, but when the guards started to take Jamie away, I jumped up and tried to block their way. "Ma'am, move aside," a guard said. Finally, I made them understand that Jamie had only been defending me. They let him go, but they could not arrest the 2 men because they'd run off. People in the waiting room had watched all this. I was too embarrassed to meet their eyes. Sitting down beside me, Jamie said, "What did I tell you?" I know. I did what you said. But the women I sat with left, and those men came and took their places." "You have to avoid things like this," he said. I didn't think I'd done anything wrong. I was proud he'd rescued me, but it wasn't a story I'd repeat to anyone. Aunt Sweet had taught us to respond politely to questions from our elders without being inquisitive or talking too much. As a result, and perhaps because I was naturally shy, I was attentive to the conversation of others, but seldom contributed a word. Traveling with Jamie, I didn't have to say anything because he spoke for both of us, and since he was a good talker, I enjoyed his lively exchanges with the people who sat nearby. He liked people, I could see, and people responded warmly to his friendly manner. Maybe because he seemed genuinely to care about them, they shared where they'd come from and where they were going, along with sad details like bereavement and financial loss. I noted that for all his talking, Jamie revealed almost nothing about us. I was not tempted to speak until a new group of passengers appeared, a woman with 2 little girls and a baby in her arms. I'd heard them coming down the aisle of our train car, the baby crying and the woman directing the children to stop dawdling or she'd be stepping on their heels. "Myra, Amelia, stop here," she said. "There's empty seats, don't you see?" She nodded toward the empty bench across from Jamie and me. "We'll sit there." Jamie had stretched out his legs, and now he pulled them back to let the woman and her children pass. I smiled at the sweet, smooth faces of the girls, who were yellow-haired, like my cousins. The older one pulled herself onto the seat, but the younger, who looked to be 2 or 3, needed help, and her mother's hands were full. "Myra," the mother said, "give her a hand, can't you?" I looked to the mother. "May I help?" She sighed. "I'd be grateful." The mother was standing in front of Jamie, and he had a slight look of irritation on his face. He'd be grateful to have them settled somewhere else, I knew. "Hello," I said to the toddler. "May I lift you to your seat?" She turned and smiled. "Just do it," Jamie said. As soon as she was on the seat, the toddler began to struggle with her sister for space at the window. Ignoring them, the mother deposited her valise on the floor by Jamie's legs and laid the baby on its stomach across her knees. The baby continued to cry. "I'm Mrs. Goldstone," she said. "This here is Henry. I'm glad we finally got a boy, so maybe my husband will stop all that nonsense." I wasn't used to people speaking so frankly about intimate things, though girls at school had whispered about the kind of activity that resulted in babies. I'd been wondering if I soon might not have one of my own, for there'd been a lot of that kind of activity. Since she'd introduced herself, I had to respond. "I'm Mrs. Long." "How do?" she said. "Besides these girls here, me and my man's got 2 married girls and a grandbaby on the way, don't you know? And now I've been blessed with Henry." She looked exhausted. Her little girls were fussing and pushing each to get the best place at their window. Jamie looked irritated. "Why not let one of them sit over here?" I said. I was thinking I'd take the older one who seemed better behaved, but the younger child reached toward me. "It'd be a big help," Mrs. Goldstone said. I heard Jamie's grunt of displeasure as I placed the child at the window on our side. Mrs. Goldstone asked, "Is this here Mr. Long?" "He is," I said. Jamie didn't reply. With a few jolts, the train moved ahead. Mrs. Goldstone gave a little shriek. "Oh, I'm riding backwards. Sometimes that makes me sick. I wonder, would you change sides?" I didn't mind which way I sat because it seemed as interesting to see the scenery behind us as ahead, but I shrugged because Jamie was staring stubbornly up the aisle. "Sorry, I shouldn't ask," she said. "You've been right kind." The motion of the train settled the girls, but the baby continued to cry. "It's his time to eat," she said, unbuttoning the front of her dress and fumbling till she had the baby's mouth in the right place. "Hope you all don't mind." The baby began to nurse with a smacking sound. Without a word, Jamie left his seat and went through the door at the end of our car. "Sorry," Mrs. Goldstone said, acknowledging his discomfort. "Some men ain't used to the way of things. So where are you going?" "Jennytown," I said. "Where's that?" "West Virginia." "Goodness, we're in West Virginia now. I mean, like where? I wonder if that place is near Lewisburg." I had no idea. She chatted while the baby nursed. She was on her way to Lewisburg from Kentucky, and her husband was moving their house goods by wagon. "I thought the train would be more comfortable, but these kids has drove me wild," she said. I told her about my trip west with my cousins, and she praised me for managing them by myself. "This was before you was married?" When I nodded yes, she said, "You must have been real young." "Well, younger," I smiled. "Younger by about 6 weeks. Jamie didn't return for a full half hour, and when he did, he pulled our valises from the overhead rack. "Time to go," he said. Mrs. Goldstone said, "Oh, are we close to Jennytown?" He didn't say. "Goodbye, then," Mrs. Goldstone said. "Guess I'll move over. I hope the next folks that sits here is as nice as you." I'd thought Jamie was everything I needed, but talking with Mrs. Goldstone had widened my hopes and expectations. "Good luck in your new home," I said. "Same to you." She waved. Jamie led me through the passageway to the next car, where we sat down with a family that talked in a different language and paid no attention to us. "We shouldn't bother with other folks," he said. This confused me. It didn't seem wrong to help. The next station was Lewisburg. "We change trains here," Jamie said. When we stepped to the platform, I saw Mrs. Goldstone walking away, clutching the baby and her valise and ordering her girls to step lively. Jamie and I went into the station building. We waited in Lewisburg 3 days for a freight train that included a passenger car, because no passenger trains went to Jennytown. The first 2 nights we slept in the woods. Jamie's money was running low, and he said we should save the Golden Eagles for something more important. I wished I could tell Uncle Bert how frugal he was, and how carefully he protected me. I was also bursting with desire to tell someone how sweetly he loved me, but that would have to be our secret. Our last night, Jamie agreed to find a rooming house so we could wash ourselves and our clothes. I was happy to have a bed and a roof over our heads once more. Finally, we boarded a car attached to the freight train. It was old with wooden seats, but Jamie said we'd reach our destination before nightfall. Soon we were in the mountains, steep, wooded and high, with twisty, narrow valleys. The freight engine chugged up the grades, sending out clouds of black smoke and bits of cinders that at times drifted through the open windows. The views, though, were beautiful. I tried to get Jamie to tell me about Jennytown, the size of it, and the kind of houses and shops, but it turned out he knew little about those things. "I got a buddy started a sawmill there," he said. "Told me he'd give me a job anytime." A friend in a new place sounded good to me. I imagined him with a wife who'd be my friend.